He bought an old couch for pennies because he had no other choice. He just wanted somewhere to sit after long, exhausting days. But a few months later, he felt a strange, solid lump hidden inside that couch. When he realized what it really was, his life was never the same again. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. The city where Marcus lived had once been proud of its factories. It had been the kind of place where the air smelled of oil and hot metal, where the rhythm of shift changes set the clock for the entire community. By the time Marcus arrived there, those days existed only in faded photographs hanging crookedly in the local diner. The factories were gone, replaced by locked gates, broken windows, and fields of weeds that crept through cracks in concrete, as if nature itself was trying to erase every trace of industry. The neighborhood where Marcus rented a room sat at the very edge of the city, close to the old freight rail line. At night, long trains still passed, their horns echoing through empty streets, the sound stretching into the darkness like a reminder that the world beyond this forgotten corner was still moving forward without him. The buildings in his district leaned inward as if they were tired of standing. Paint peeled from their walls in long curled strips that fluttered in the wind, and signs advertising apartments for rent had been hanging in the same windows for years, the phone numbers sun-bleached into near invisibility. Most of the storefronts were shuttered. The few that remained open sold cheap beer, lottery tickets, or cigarettes behind thick plastic windows. The sidewalks were cracked and uneven, forcing pedestrians to watch their steps, though few people walked there at all. The street lights flickered or failed entirely, leaving long stretches of road drowned in shadow after sunset. Marcus often felt that if he disappeared one night, the neighborhood itself would swallow the fact, and no one would notice the absence. He had not always lived like this. There had been a time when his life fit together in a way that made sense. He had held a steady job at a regional warehouse on the outskirts of town, loading and unloading shipments bound for bigger cities. The work was hard, but the pay was enough to cover rent on a small apartment, keep food in the fridge, and even allow the occasional treat. He had a battered couch back then, too, but it had been his, not something rescued from someone else's discard pile. He had talked about saving for school, about moving somewhere with better opportunities, about building a life that did not revolve around making it through the week. Then the layoffs came, as they always did when corporations decided that entire towns were no longer profitable. At first, Marcus believed he would bounce back. He took temporary gigs, short contracts, anything that kept money flowing. But those jobs never lasted. One ended when the company downsized, another when the manager decided he could hire 2 teenagers for the price of 1 adult. A minor injury at one site slowed him down just enough to cost him the next opportunity. Medical bills followed, not catastrophic, but heavy enough to tip an already unstable balance. The apartment went first, then the car. Each loss pushed him further away from the version of himself he remembered, the one who made plans instead of excuses. His relationships eroded quietly. Friends stopped calling when he could no longer afford to meet them for drinks. Family members, sympathetic at first, grew weary of the repeated assurances that things would improve soon. Marcus never blamed them. He understood that desperation had a way of exhausting everyone around it. Eventually, he learned to rely only on himself, not because he believed he was strong, but because he had no other choice. The room he rented was barely large enough to be called a room. It was carved out of what had once been a living room in a subdivided house, separated by thin drywall that let every sound pass through as if there were no barrier at all. His neighbors were strangers he recognized only by their footsteps and the muffled cadence of their voices. The floorboards creaked so loudly that he could hear when someone shifted their weight in the middle of the night. The shared hallway smelled of old cooking oil and damp clothes, and the single bathroom at the end of the corridor was in a perpetual state of disrepair. Marcus owned almost nothing. A thin mattress lay directly on the floor, its edges fraying, the springs pressing through in places that made sleeping a careful negotiation between comfort and pain. He had one plastic chair salvaged from a yard sale and a stack of cardboard boxes that functioned as shelves. On top of one box sat an old electric kettle he used to make instant noodles and cheap coffee. He kept the heat low during winter, wearing layers indoors rather than watching his utility bill climb beyond reach. In the evenings, he turned on a battered laptop, not to watch anything in particular, but to fill the silence. The low murmur of news anchors or reruns kept him from feeling like the walls were closing in. There were days when the weight of it all felt too heavy to carry. Those were the days when he counted every dollar in his wallet twice before buying groceries, when he chose bread and canned soup over anything fresh, when he told himself that hunger was easier to manage than debt. On one such evening, after coming home from a 12-hour shift at a construction site where he had been hired through a temp agency with no guarantee of work the next day, he sat on the edge of his mattress and realized that he could not remember the last time he had sat somewhere that felt like rest. That was when the idea of a couch began to take hold. It was not about luxury. It was about dignity, about the simple human need to sit down without feeling like you were camping in your own life. He imagined a place where he could drink coffee in the morning without balancing a mug on his knee, where he could watch the news and pretend for half an hour that he lived like everyone else. The problem, as always, was money. He had been saving what little he could toward his phone bill and the next month's rent. Buying furniture felt reckless, even childish, but the thought of another winter spent sitting on the floor gnawed at him. When he saw a flyer taped to a telephone pole on his way home from work advertising a clearance sale from a local senior care charity, he stopped and read it twice. Furniture from a recently closed wing of a residential facility was being sold at steep discounts to clear storage space. The address was only a few blocks away. On impulse, he tore off one of the little paper tabs with the phone number and stuffed it into his pocket. The warehouse where the sale was held was nothing like the polished showrooms downtown. It was a wide, echoing space that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old wood. Rows of mismatched furniture stretched across the concrete floor. Tables with water rings, dressers with missing handles, lamps whose shades had yellowed with age. People wandered slowly between the aisles, some accompanied by family members, others alone, examining items with the careful eye of those who could not afford mistakes. Marcus moved quietly, trying not to draw attention to himself. He felt exposed there, surrounded by strangers who were all, in one way or another, shopping for the remnants of someone else's life. Then he saw the couch. It was parked against a wall, partially hidden behind a rack of old wheelchairs. The fabric was stained and threadbare, and it carried a faint medicinal odor that no amount of cleaning would likely erase. But its dimensions were almost exactly what he needed. It was narrow enough to fit into his tiny room and long enough to double as a bed on nights when the floor mattress became unbearable. A volunteer approached him with a clipboard and told him the price, a fraction of what even the cheapest store would charge. Marcus hesitated only long enough to feel the weight of the cash in his pocket, then nodded. He did not ask where the couch came from. The volunteer mentioned something about a family donating furniture after clearing out a relative's room, but Marcus barely heard it. All he could think about was whether he could carry the couch back by himself. It took him nearly an hour to wrestle it through the warehouse doors and down the street. The thing was heavier than it looked, awkwardly balanced, and he had to stop several times to catch his breath. A passerby eventually helped him navigate the narrow entrance to his building, though the man left as quickly as he had arrived, offering nothing more than a brief nod. By the time Marcus dragged the couch into his room, his arms were trembling and his shirt was soaked with sweat. He stood there for a long moment, hands on his hips, staring at the piece of furniture as if it were an accomplishment rather than a burden. The room looked different now, fuller, more like a place someone actually lived. When he finally sat down, the couch creaked loudly, and a puff of dust rose from the cushions. It was uncomfortable and smelled faintly of antiseptic and age, but Marcus closed his eyes and leaned back anyway. For the first time in months, he felt like he had claimed a small piece of normality in a life that had been reduced to survival. He did not yet know that this battered couch was more than a temporary comfort. He only knew that in a city that had forgotten him, in a room that barely held his existence, he had found something that felt like a beginning. At first, Marcus was simply grateful. The couch, ugly as it was, had transformed his narrow room into something that almost resembled a living space. When he came home in the evenings after hauling bricks or sweeping job sites, he no longer dropped onto the cold floor or the thin mattress that pressed into his bones. He sat on the sagging cushions, kicked off his boots, and allowed himself a few minutes of stillness before the next cycle of worries set in. The smell bothered him, but he told himself it was the price of buying something that had lived a long life before finding its way to him. He tried to clean it as best he could. He borrowed a vacuum cleaner from a neighbor and spent an entire Saturday attacking every seam and fold. Dust, lint, and fragments of ancient crumbs disappeared into the hose, but the couch remained stubbornly resistant to improvement. The faint medicinal odor clung to the fabric no matter how many times he wiped it down with a damp cloth mixed with baking soda. He opened the window even on cold evenings, letting icy air cut through the room in the hope that the smell would finally lift. It never did. It lingered in the air like a memory that refused to fade. The couch was uncomfortable in ways that went beyond age. One side was noticeably softer than the other, collapsing under his weight as if the stuffing had long since surrendered. The opposite side, the one closest to the wall, felt rigid, almost wooden. When he shifted positions, he could hear faint internal creaks, not the ordinary groan of old springs, but something deeper, more solid, as though the couch held something it was reluctant to reveal. He ignored it at first. He had learned not to question his luck. When you live as close to the edge as he did, you take what you can get and do not ask whether you deserve better. Even so, the couch began to intrude into his thoughts. He noticed that whenever he slept on it, he woke with a strange soreness along his side, not the diffuse ache of overworked muscles, but a pinpoint pressure that seemed to originate from a single place beneath the cushion. He shifted his position, rearranged the pillows he had scavenged from a thrift store, and told himself he was being paranoid. Furniture, after all, was full of hidden mechanisms, broken frames, twisted wires, forgotten repairs. There were 100 harmless explanations for a lumpy couch. His evenings settled into a pattern. He returned from whatever job he had managed to secure that day, heated water in the kettle, poured it over noodles or instant rice, and ate directly from the pot to save washing dishes. Then he sank into the couch and let the low hum of the laptop fill the silence. Sometimes he fell asleep there without meaning to, the screen casting blue light over the walls. Those were the nights when the discomfort was hardest to ignore. He would wake with the sensation that something inside the couch was pushing back against him, not violently, but with a persistent pressure that refused to be dismissed. One evening, he dropped his keys between the cushions. They slid into the gap and disappeared. He cursed under his breath and reached down to retrieve them. His fingers brushed against something that was neither metal nor wood. It was firm but not rigid, yielding slightly beneath his touch before springing back into place. The sensation made his stomach tighten. He froze, hand still buried in the couch, heart beating louder than the distant trains outside his window. He withdrew his fingers slowly and stared at them as if they might have changed shape. He told himself it was nothing. A folded blanket, perhaps, or an old pillow someone had stuffed into the frame to make the couch last longer. He retrieved his keys by shaking the cushion loose and tried to laugh at his own jumpiness. Yet the feeling clung to him long after he had turned off the light. Lying in the dark, he replayed the moment in his mind, the subtle give beneath his fingers, the way the material had not felt like fabric at all, but like something wrapped, something contained. Over the next few days, he tested the couch without fully admitting to himself what he was doing. He sat in different spots, pressed his palms into the seams, leaned his weight against the rigid side. Each time he touched the same area, he felt it again, that unmistakable bulge hidden deep beneath layers of fabric and padding. It was not random. It had shape, a contour that his hands began to recognize. The more he tried to rationalize it, the less convincing his explanations became. Whatever was inside that couch did not belong there. Marcus had learned to avoid trouble. Trouble cost money. Trouble led to conversations with landlords, to phone calls he could not afford to answer, to paperwork that demanded time he did not have. He told himself that opening the couch would only create new problems. If he found something broken, he would not be able to fix it. If he found something dangerous, he would not know what to do with it. He tried to live with the mystery instead, telling himself that it was easier to ignore discomfort than to invite chaos, but the couch would not let him forget. Each night he lay on it, shifting to avoid the unyielding spot, feeling the faint pressure against his ribs. Each day he noticed how his gaze drifted to the same corner of the frame, how his mind circled back to the same questions. The object inside the couch became a presence in the room, invisible yet oppressive. He began locking his door more carefully, checking the window latch before sleeping, as if whatever was hidden there might somehow escape. The tension built slowly, like water seeping into the cracks of a dam. One Sunday morning, he woke earlier than usual, the room heavy with silence. The trains had already passed, leaving behind a hollow stillness that made every sound inside the house echo. He lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to his own breathing, until he realized he was thinking about nothing but the couch. The thought exhausted him. He was tired of guessing, tired of the way the unknown gnawed at him more relentlessly than hunger or cold ever had. He stood up and paced the narrow space between the couch and the wall. His eyes traced the worn pattern in the fabric, the slight indentation that marked the rigid side. He imagined what it would feel like to finally know. The idea frightened him, but it also carried a strange promise of relief. Whatever he found, at least it would be real. At least it would not live only in his imagination. He retrieved a small utility knife from the drawer where he kept tools scavenged from past jobs. He held it loosely at first, as if testing the weight, then set it down again. His pulse thudded in his ears. He was about to violate the only piece of furniture he owned, to risk turning a fragile improvement in his life into yet another loss. Yet, he could not shake the sense that the couch itself was demanding this from him, that it would not be content to remain silent. The decision did not arrive in a dramatic burst. It settled over him quietly, the way fatigue settles into bones. He picked up the knife again and knelt beside the couch, pressing his fingers once more into the bulge hidden beneath the fabric. The shape was there, unmistakable, patient. Whatever it was, it had waited a long time to be found. And now, in a forgotten room on the edge of a forgotten city, it was done waiting. Marcus waited until the light outside his window shifted from the dull gray of dawn to a pale, uncertain blue. The house was quiet in that fragile hour between night and morning, when most of the tenants were still asleep and the hallway carried no footsteps. He had slept poorly, waking every time his body rolled toward the unyielding side of the couch. Each time he had touched the fabric, he had felt that same dense resistance beneath his palm, the same silent insistence that something inside was wrong. Now, sitting on the edge of the thin mattress on the floor, he held the small utility knife in both hands and wondered how his life had come to a moment like this. The kettle sat cold on the box that served as his table. He had meant to make coffee, but the idea of wasting even a few minutes on routine suddenly felt unbearable. He needed to know. The need was not driven by greed or hope, but by the simple fact that the unknown had become heavier than the couch itself. He rose and crossed the room, placing the knife on the armrest as if he were offering it to the furniture, asking permission to break the silence that had built up between them. For a long moment, he only stood there, tracing the pattern of the worn fabric with his eyes. It was a dull brown, mottled with stains that hinted at decades of use. He tried to imagine who had sat here before him, what kind of life had unfolded on these cushions. The couch had not always belonged to him. It had carried someone else's weight, someone else's secrets. The thought tightened his chest. He crouched and pressed his fingers into the familiar spot. The resistance was immediate, as if something were pressing back from the other side. His hand trembled. He placed the tip of the knife against the seam and hesitated once more, then forced himself to apply pressure. The blade slid through the fabric with a soft, tearing sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. He flinched, half expecting a neighbor to bang on the wall and demand an explanation, but the house remained still. He cut slowly, peeling back the outer layer of upholstery to reveal a mass of yellowed padding beneath. Dust billowed into the air, carrying the stale scent of age and neglect. He coughed, wiped his eyes, and continued. Beneath the padding, he found a thick layer of burlap, then the rough wooden frame of the couch. The work was harder than he had expected. His fingers ached as he pried loose staples and pulled away fabric that had been driven deep into the frame decades earlier. Then his knife struck something that was not wood. It made a dull, hollow sound, muffled but unmistakably different. His breath caught in his throat. He widened the opening, tearing the burlap aside with his hands. There, wedged between the wooden supports, was a tightly wrapped bundle encased in layers of yellowed plastic and brittle bubble wrap. It was so carefully hidden that he felt as if he had stumbled into a crime scene, some private ritual frozen in time. He stared at the bundle for a full minute before daring to touch it. When he did, he found that it was heavier than he expected, solid in his hands, as though it were filled with something that resisted compression. His heart began to pound so hard that he could hear the rush of blood in his ears. He carried the bundle to the small patch of floor beside his mattress and set it down, kneeling in front of it as if before an altar. Peeling away the layers of plastic was like unwrapping a gift he had never asked for. The bubble wrap crackled softly, the sound echoing through the room. At last he reached the innermost layer and found a plain brown envelope sealed with yellowing tape. He slid a finger beneath the flap and opened it. The first thing he saw was the edge of a banknote. It was new, crisp, its green ink stark against the dullness of the room. He pulled it free, then another, until a small stack lay in his palm. His hands began to shake. He counted slowly, not trusting his eyes. $20, $40, $60. The numbers climbed until he lost track and had to start over. When he was done, he sat back on his heels and stared at the money in disbelief. He returned to the couch as if in a trance, widening the hole and reaching deeper into the frame. His fingers brushed against another bundle, then another. He extracted them one by one, laying them in a growing pile on the floor. Each was wrapped with the same care. Each held another envelope, another set of neatly stacked bills. The room filled with the rustle of paper and plastic, the sounds blending into a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. By the time he finished, the pile at his feet looked unreal, like something from a movie he would have dismissed as exaggerated. He began to count in earnest, sorting the envelopes into stacks, his breath coming faster with every addition. The total grew until it passed figures he had only ever seen on loan applications or news reports. When he reached the end, his stomach lurched. The amount was far beyond anything he had ever imagined possessing. It was more than he had earned in years of labor. It was enough to rewrite his entire story. For a brief, dangerous moment, he allowed himself to imagine what that story could be. He saw himself walking into a bank and opening an account without fear of overdraft fees. He saw himself renting a real apartment with separate rooms and walls thick enough to keep out the world. He saw himself standing in a grocery store aisle, choosing food based on taste rather than price. The images flooded his mind so quickly that they left him dizzy. Then he found the last envelope. It was smaller than the others and taped to the inside of the couch frame, as if it had been added later, almost as an afterthought. Inside were not bills, but scraps of paper, folded and refolded until the creases had nearly torn through. He smoothed them out carefully. They were receipts from a pharmacy, medical appointment cards, notes written in a shaky hand. One of them bore a name, written in careful letters as if the writer were afraid of making a mistake. Marcus felt something inside him shift. The name did not mean anything to him, but the handwriting did. It spoke of age, of effort, of someone who had taken the time to record their life on these small pieces of paper. He read the dates and realized that the most recent were only a few years old. Whoever had hidden this money had not done so in some distant past. They might still be alive. The weight of the situation settled over him like a physical presence. The money no longer felt like a miracle. It felt like a burden. He gathered the envelopes back into their plastic wrappings, his movements slower now, more deliberate. He returned the bundles to the cavity in the couch but left the opening gaping, unable to bring himself to seal it shut. The couch looked wounded, its insides exposed, and in a way he felt the same. He sank down onto the floor, his back against the wall, and stared at the pile of documents in his lap. somewhere out there was a person who had trusted this battered piece of furniture with their life savings. They had folded those bills and wrapped them with care, not knowing that one day a stranger would be kneeling in a rented room, hands trembling, wondering what to do with the legacy they had never intended to give away. Marcus closed his eyes and pressed the papers to his chest. He had wanted answers. Now he had more questions than ever. For a long time after discovering the papers, Marcus did nothing at all. He sat on the floor with his back pressed against the wall, the open wound in the couch staring at him like an accusation. The room felt different now, as if the air itself had thickened. What had begun as a search for relief from discomfort had turned into an encounter with someone else's hidden world, and he was no longer certain that he had the right to be there. He spread the scraps of paper across the mattress and studied them one by one. There were pharmacy receipts with dates that stretched back several years, each marked with amounts that suggested a fixed income spent carefully. There were appointment reminders from clinics he vaguely recognized from his own trips through the city, places that catered mostly to the elderly and the uninsured. Some notes were written in pencil so faded that the words were nearly gone, but the repetition of certain expenses was unmistakable. Medication refills, co-pays, transportation costs. This was not a ledger of wealth. It was a record of survival. The name appeared more than once, always written slowly, as though the person had paused between letters. Marcus traced it with his finger, feeling an unexpected pull of kinship. He had no idea who this person was, but he recognized the carefulness of the handwriting, the way each stroke seemed to conserve energy. He imagined a frail hand resting on the arm of the couch, the same arm where he had placed his own knife hours earlier, and felt a shiver pass through him. The logic of hiding money and furniture no longer seemed strange. He knew the fear that came with trusting banks when you had little, the anxiety of watching fees devour what you had managed to save. He had met people who kept their cash in jars, in envelopes tucked behind photographs, in socks buried in drawers. For someone who no longer felt safe in the world, who had perhaps been betrayed by systems that were supposed to protect them, the couch could become the most reliable vault imaginable. It was always nearby, always under your eyes, a fortress disguised as comfort. As Marcus pieced together the fragments of this unseen life, he felt as if he were trespassing on something sacred. The receipts told a story of decline, of increasing medical needs, of a body that demanded more care each year. There were gaps, too, months where no papers appeared, which he imagined as times when the owner of the couch had been too ill to write anything down or too frightened to venture out. He wondered who had finally emptied the room where this couch once stood, who had decided that it was just another object to be sold off in a charity warehouse. The couch was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a relic of someone else's private struggle. Marcus found himself speaking to it under his breath, apologizing for cutting into it, as if the object itself might feel the violation. He thought about the volunteer at the warehouse mentioning a family donation, about the casual way the couch had been passed from one set of hands to another. Somewhere between a hospital discharge and a clearance sale, a lifetime of savings had been lost. With the realization came fear. If the money had belonged to someone who was still alive, they might be looking for it. They might have gone back to the place where they last remembered the couch, only to find an empty room and no answers. Or worse, they might believe that the money was gone forever, that the years they had spent hiding it had been for nothing. The thought made Marcus's chest tighten. He could imagine the despair of discovering that the one thing you trusted had been taken away while you were too weak to stop it. He also considered darker possibilities. What if the money had been a part of something illegal, a forgotten stash from a life he could not imagine? But the papers in his hands contradicted that narrative. This was not the hoard of a criminal. It was the hoard of someone afraid, someone who had no one else to rely on. That afternoon, he returned to the warehouse where he had bought the couch. The building was quieter now, the sale nearly over. He recognized the volunteer who had rung up his purchase and waited until there were no other customers before approaching her. He did not mention the money. He only asked about the couch, about where it had come from, who had donated it. The woman frowned slightly, her memory clearly strained by the dozens of similar questions she had fielded that week. She told him what she could. A family had brought in several pieces of furniture after clearing out a room in a residential care facility that had recently downsized. She could not recall the name, only that they had seemed overwhelmed, eager to get rid of the items as quickly as possible. Marcus thanked her and left, the information both helpful and infuriatingly vague. The trail was there, but it was thin. It led through institutions that thrived on paperwork and privacy, through people who saw furniture as inventory rather than as fragments of human lives. Still, it was something. It was a beginning. That evening, he returned to his room with a resolve he had not felt before. He gathered the papers and sorted them into a neat stack, then placed them in a folder he had once used to hold job applications. He tucked the folder into his backpack and zipped it shut, as if by containing the documents he could also contain the responsibility they carried. He did not tell anyone about the money. He did not even tell the walls, which had heard all his other confessions. The secret sat heavy in his mind, a constant presence that colored every thought. When he lay down on the mattress that night, he did not dare sleep on the couch. It seemed wrong, now that he knew what it held. Instead, he stared at the ceiling and thought about the person whose life had intersected with his in such an improbable way. By morning, he had made a decision, though he could not yet articulate it fully. He would not spend the money. Not until he understood its story. He would find the person behind the careful handwriting, the one who had trusted a battered couch with everything they had. The money would remain hidden, a silent witness to a promise he had not spoken aloud but already felt bound to keep. Marcus had promised himself he would not touch the money, not a single bill, until he understood who it truly belonged to. Yet the promise did not silence the storm in his head. Every time he passed the couch, now crudely opened and stitched back together with rough thread, he felt the weight of the hidden bundles as if they were strapped to his chest. He had never possessed anything so valuable, and the knowledge of it made ordinary moments feel unreal. The walk to work, the counting of coins at the grocery store, even the small talk with coworkers all carried a faint echo of the question he was trying not to ask. What kind of man would he become if he kept this secret only for himself? He forced himself to keep living as if nothing had changed. He rose early, brewed the same thin coffee, took the same buses. But the world around him had shifted. Where he once saw only his own reflection in every cracked window, he now saw others more clearly. The woman who lived 2 doors down, who always carried her groceries in 3 separate trips because she could not afford a cart, seemed suddenly more fragile. The man at the construction site who hid his trembling hands in his pockets during lunch breaks no longer looked merely tired. Marcus recognized in them the same exhaustion he had felt before the couch entered his life, the same sense of being one accident away from collapse. It was on one of those mornings that the idea of helping began to form, not as a grand plan, but as a quiet impulse. He was standing in line at a corner store, holding a loaf of bread and a can of soup, when the customer ahead of him reached the register and began apologizing to the clerk. She had miscounted the change in her purse and was a few dollars short. The clerk sighed, clearly irritated, and Marcus felt the familiar burn of helplessness rise in his throat. Without thinking, he stepped forward and placed a bill on the counter, covering the difference. He told himself it was nothing, that he would have done the same before the couch, that it did not count as touching the secret money. Yet, he knew that was a lie. He knew exactly which pocket the bill had come from. The woman thanked him with a look that was equal parts relief and disbelief, and Marcus felt something loosen inside him. It was not joy, not even pride, but a sense of alignment, as though a piece of his life that had long been out of place had finally settled where it belonged. He walked out of the store lighter than he had entered, though his wallet was thinner. That was how it started. He did not make a habit of it immediately, fearing he might lose control if he allowed himself to think of the money as his to distribute. Instead, he framed each small act of generosity as a temporary measure, a bridge between ignorance and responsibility. When the elderly woman across the hall mentioned that she had been skipping medication because her insurance no longer covered the full cost, he slipped an envelope under her door the next day with just enough to cover the refill. He did not sign it. He did not wait for thanks. He told himself he was only buying time, that these gestures were placeholders until he could return everything to its rightful owner. At the construction site, he began carrying extra lunches, handing them off to men who pretended not to need them. He paid for a co-worker's gas when the man's car sputtered to a stop in the parking lot, and the look of panic on his face reminded Marcus too much of his own past. Each time he did it, he felt the same mixture of fear and relief. Fear that someone would notice the pattern, relief that the money was not sitting uselessly inside the couch while people around him struggled. He kept meticulous notes in a small notebook recording every dollar he spent, every reason. The list grew quickly, but it was never enough to satisfy him. He was acutely aware that these were not his savings to dispense, that he was walking a narrow line between compassion and theft. Some nights he lay awake rehearsing the words he would use to explain himself when the time came, though he had no idea who he would be explaining anything to. As the days passed, the secret began to shape his behavior in subtler ways. He no longer complained about his own hardships, not because they had disappeared, but because they seemed smaller in the light of what he was able to do for others. He still counted every dollar when he paid rent, still chose the cheapest items on the menu, but he did so with a strange calm, knowing that his life was no longer defined solely by what he lacked. At the same time, the fear of discovery grew. He avoided inviting anyone into his room, afraid that a curious glance might linger on the patched section of the couch. He kept the documents hidden in his backpack, which he carried with him even on short trips to the store. The backpack became an extension of his body, a constant reminder of the responsibility he bore. It was impossible to help everyone. For every person he managed to assist, there were 10 more he had to walk past. He learned quickly that generosity did not erase injustice, that money could solve immediate problems, but not the systems that created them. That realization did not discourage him. It sharpened his sense of urgency. He could not fix the world, but he could at least prevent a few cracks from widening. Gradually, his focus returned to the papers he had found in the couch. He studied them each night, cross-referencing clinic names with bus routes, mapping addresses that might have been connected to the owner of the money. He called social services under the pretense of seeking information for a school project, learning how records were kept, what kinds of requests were possible. The process was slow and riddled with dead ends, but he persisted, fueled by the conviction that the kindness he was practicing now was only a rehearsal for the act that would truly matter. The more he gave, the more he felt compelled to find the person behind the careful handwriting. He imagined them alone in a hospital room, wondering where their couch had gone, whether their savings were lost forever. The thought haunted him. The kindness he could not lock away was becoming a compass, pointing him toward a conclusion he could no longer postpone. He had to find them. He had to close the circle he had opened when he first slid the knife into the couch. Marcus no longer thought of the money as something he possessed. It had become a problem he was responsible for, a weight that pulled him through each day with a strange combination of dread and purpose. The small acts of kindness he had begun to allow himself had not eased the urgency of his mission. If anything, they had made it more pressing. Every time he slipped a bill into an envelope or paid for someone else's groceries, he was reminded that the true resolution lay not in scattered gestures, but in restoring a story that had been broken. He began by turning his room into a crude archive. Each evening, he laid out the scraps of paper from the couch on his mattress and arranged them in chronological order. The earliest receipts were almost 10 years old, faded to the color of tea, while the most recent still held the crispness of fresh ink. He noticed patterns he had missed before. The same pharmacy appeared again and again, always with a small handwritten note next to the total, as if the owner of the money had wanted to track not only the expense, but the necessity of it. There were appointment cards from a clinic on the other side of the city, one he had passed many times without ever going inside. The address was scribbled in the corner of several papers, slightly misspelled, as though it had been written from memory rather than copied. Marcus bought a cheap map from a convenience store and spread it out on the floor. He circled every location he recognized from the papers, drawing lines between them. The pattern pointed unmistakably toward a cluster of streets near the river, an area dominated by low-rise buildings and social service offices. He recognized the district from his own wanderings, remembered standing in line there once to apply for emergency assistance when his savings had finally run dry. The next step was harder. He visited the pharmacy listed on most of the receipts, presenting himself as a student doing research on how prescription costs affected elderly patients. The lie felt thin on his tongue, but it opened doors that would have remained closed otherwise. The pharmacist listened politely, offered general information about the challenges their older customers faced, but declined to discuss any individual case. Marcus thanked him and left, no closer to a name but with a clearer sense of the obstacles ahead. At the clinic, he had similar experiences. The waiting room was crowded with people who carried their lives in folders and plastic bags. He watched them while he waited to be called to the reception desk, trying not to stare. When his turn came, he repeated his story, this time adding details about a fictional professor who had assigned him the project. The receptionist nodded sympathetically and handed him a pamphlet on patient privacy. She could not help him, she said, not without proper authorization. He walked out into the cold air feeling both foolish and stubborn. The system was designed to protect people, and here he was trying to penetrate it with nothing but a stack of receipts and a sense of obligation. Yet the frustration only sharpened his resolve. He began visiting senior centers, introducing himself as a volunteer looking to assist residents with errands. The centers were underfunded and overstretched, and they welcomed any help they could get, even from a man who clearly had little to give. He spent afternoons listening to stories that had nothing to do with his search. Elderly men told him about jobs that no longer existed, about neighborhoods that had been razed to make room for highways. Women showed him photographs of grandchildren they rarely saw. Each conversation was a reminder of the fragility of memory, of how easily a life could be reduced to a few scraps of paper tucked inside a couch. He began to ask gentle questions, inquiring about people who might have used furniture as makeshift beds, about residents who had left suddenly after surgery or illness. Most shrugged. Some remembered fragments. An old man mentioned a woman who had insisted on bringing her own couch into the facility, claiming she could not sleep without it. A nurse recalled helping a patient who had been transferred to a rehabilitation center after back surgery, her belongings packed in a hurry by relatives who seemed impatient to be done with the ordeal. These hints coalesced into a tentative narrative. The couch had not been abandoned lightly. It had been a part of a desperate attempt to preserve something stable in the face of bodily failure and bureaucratic upheaval. Marcus clung to that idea as he traced the remaining threads. The breakthrough came in the form of a nearly illegible note on the back of one of the receipts. He had overlooked it dozens of times, mistaking it for a coffee stain. Under the right light, he made out a sequence of numbers that resembled a room designation rather than a phone number. He compared it with the layout of a residential care facility he found online and realized it matched a wing that had been closed the previous year. He returned to the warehouse where he had bought the couch, this time armed with more specific questions. The volunteer who had sold him the furniture was not there, but another staff member recognized the name of the facility when Marcus mentioned it. Yes, she said, a family had donated several items after their mother's discharge. She could not remember the family's name, but she recalled that they had seemed distracted, as though they were dealing with more than just the logistics of moving furniture. That night, Marcus searched through public records at the library, scanning obituaries and hospital discharge announcements in old newspapers. It was tedious, emotionally draining work, but he persisted. Eventually, he found a short article about a woman who had undergone back surgery and been transferred to a rehabilitation center shortly after. The name matched the handwriting on the papers in his backpack. The article mentioned that she had been living alone since her husband's death, and that her daughter had arranged the move. Marcus closed his eyes when he saw the name in print. It was not the relief he had expected. It was something heavier, a sense that the abstract story he had constructed was solidifying into a real person with real pain. He copied down the daughter's name and address from a brief follow-up piece that described a charity drive organized in her mother's honor. He did not contact her immediately. He spent 2 days rehearsing what he would say, how he would explain the couch, the money, the choices he had made. He gathered photographs of the hidden compartment, scanned the receipts, prepared himself for disbelief and anger. When he finally dialed the number listed in the article, his hands were shaking. He did not mention the amount. He told her only that he had purchased a couch that once belonged to her mother, and that he believed he had found something that was important to her. The pause on the other end of the line felt like a physical presence. Then she began to cry. By the time Marcus hung up, his head was spinning. He had agreed to meet her in person the following afternoon, at a coffee shop near the rehabilitation center where her mother was still recovering. He set his phone down on the mattress and stared at the couch, now stitched and silent, its secret finally on the verge of becoming someone else's again. He felt a deep, almost painful sense of anticipation, as though he were standing at the edge of a story that was about to end, even as it gave way to something new. Marcus barely slept the night before the meeting. The patched section of the couch seemed to glow in the dark, its uneven stitches catching the faint light from the street lamp outside his window. He lay on the mattress and listened to the trains pass, each horn sounding like a countdown. By morning, his thoughts had blurred together, a tangle of fear and resolve that left him feeling hollow rather than nervous. He showered in lukewarm water, put on the cleanest clothes he owned, and packed the backpack with the documents, the photographs, and the envelopes he had so carefully prepared. The money, all that remained after his small acts of kindness, stayed hidden inside the couch. He would not carry it through the city until he knew exactly what to do with it. The coffee shop sat across from the rehabilitation center, a squat brick building with narrow windows that reflected the gray winter sky. It was a place designed for people waiting, for families who needed somewhere to sit while their loved ones learned how to walk again. Marcus chose a table near the window and set his backpack at his feet. He had arrived early, hoping the familiar routine of ordering coffee would steady his nerves, but his hands shook as he lifted the cup. When the door finally opened and the woman from the phone call stepped inside, he recognized her instantly, though he had only seen her name in print. There was a weariness in her posture that he had come to recognize in himself and in the people he had helped over the past weeks. They spoke quietly, at first about nothing in particular. The weather, the difficulty of finding parking near the center, the quality of the coffee. Marcus let her set the pace, watching as the small talk wore away at her composure. When she finally asked him what he had found, her voice barely rose above the hum of conversation around them. He opened his backpack and laid the papers on the table. The receipts, the appointment cards, the handwritten notes. Her breath caught as she recognized her mother's handwriting. She touched the papers with trembling fingers, tracing the letters as Marcus had done days earlier. He showed her the photographs of the couch's interior, the cavity he had cut into, the careful wrappings that had protected the bundles from moisture and decay. He described the way he had found them, his words measured, stripped of drama, as if he were reporting a fact rather than confessing to something that had reshaped his life. When he finally told her about the money, about how much there had been, the room seemed to tilt. She closed her eyes and pressed her hands together as though in prayer. He waited, unsure whether to continue or to give her time to breathe. At last, she spoke, telling him a story that mirrored the fragments he had pieced together from scraps of paper. Her mother had been saving for decades, distrustful of banks after her husband's pension had been mishandled. The couch had been her refuge, the place where she slept when the pain in her back grew too intense to manage. After the surgery, during the chaos of hospital transfers and paperwork, the family had replaced the couch without realizing what it held. They had searched the apartment for the missing savings for weeks, then months, convinced they had lost everything. Marcus did not interrupt. He listened until the woman's voice steadied and the tears subsided. Then he told her about the kindness he had tried to show in the meantime, about the groceries and the medication and the lunches he had bought for strangers. He did not ask for absolution, only understanding. He told her that he had kept a record of every dollar he had spent, and that he was prepared to return the remainder immediately. She shook her head when he finished. She said that what he had done was more than most people would have considered. She insisted on accompanying him back to his room that same day, despite his protests, despite the cold that was beginning to seep into the afternoon. They took the bus together, sitting in silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the city slid past the windows. Marcus unlocked the door to his room with a sense of finality that surprised him. The space that had once felt like a refuge now seemed temporary, a stage for something that was about to conclude. He knelt beside the couch and carefully removed the bundles, placing them on the floor between them. The woman covered her mouth with her hand as she saw the stacks of envelopes emerge, as if the sight alone might shatter the reality she had been holding together. They counted the money together, cross-referencing his notebook, reconciling each small act of generosity with the total that remained. When they were done, the pile was smaller than it had once been, but still substantial. Marcus offered to hand it over then and there, but she asked him to wait. She told him she wanted her mother to know what he had done, to see the person who had chosen honesty over comfort. The rehabilitation center smelled of antiseptic and boiled vegetables. Marcus felt out of place in its corridors, carrying the weight of someone else's fortune in his backpack. They found her mother in a sunlit room near the end of a hallway, propped up in a bed with a blanket drawn tightly around her shoulders. She was smaller than he had imagined, her hair thin and silver, her eyes bright with curiosity. When her daughter explained why they had come, the old woman's gaze shifted to Marcus, searching his face as if trying to measure the truth of his presence. He placed the backpack on the chair beside her bed and opened it slowly. He did not speak. He let the money and the papers speak for him. When the old woman understood, she reached out and took his hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. He felt the roughness of her skin, the imprint of years he could only guess at. The words she said then were simple, stripped of eloquence by exhaustion, but they carried a weight that eclipsed every dream he had entertained when he first uncovered the couch's secret. He left the center lighter than he had arrived, though his pockets were emptier. The woman's daughter had pressed a small envelope into his hand, insisting he accept something for his trouble, but it was not enough to change his circumstances. It was not meant to. The true reward was something he carried without any physical proof. That evening, Marcus returned to his room and surveyed it as if seeing it for the first time. The couch sat against the wall, its patched fabric a testament to a story that was now complete. He considered throwing it out, erasing the physical reminder of a chapter he had closed, but he did not. Instead, he sat down on it gently, testing the place where the bulge had once haunted him. The pressure was gone. The couch was just a couch again, sagging and imperfect, but no longer burdened with someone else's fear. He did not know what his life would look like next week or next month. He was still poor, still living on the edge of a city that had little to offer him. But as he sat there, watching the light fade from the window, he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt whole. The wealth he had discovered was not measured in bills or bank accounts. It was measured in the quiet certainty that he had chosen the person he wanted to be, even when no one was watching. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next investigation, the next hidden truth, or the next life-changing discovery. New stories are coming very soon, and you'll want to be there when they drop. Share this video with your friends and family so more people can experience these real moments with you, and write in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support keeps these stories alive.